Hi, welcome to Grass Lake, Michigan. I'm Sarah Whirling, a historic preservation major at Eastern Michigan University in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Today, we're at the former estate of Everett and Ida Watson in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. This 422-acre estate used to contain a mansion up this road, which was the former lane of the farm, and up the hill at the mansion, which is now demolished, Ida's grave was found a few years ago. This wetland is part of Timms Lake Preserve now in Grass Lake, Michigan, and all that remains of their estate is just less than 7 acres in a private residence with 2 outbuildings. The rest has become a new housing development, Timms Lake Preserve. And so if we look to the north, we see what's now a residence, but was formerly one of the many agricultural outbuildings. As I said, the original mansion has been demolished, so this home was originally a barn that was used for maintenance and rabbits and a tool shed. There was a gas pump for the tractors for the farm, and miscellaneous activities occurred in that building over the decades. We're going to go north up the property and see the agricultural buildings that remain. As I said before, the mansion behind us was demolished in 1995 by the developers that did the new Timms Lake Preserve housing development. But this home was formerly the rabbit warren and tool shed, maintenance shed, that some people say Joe Louis actually trained in the barn or in this building. We do know that he came here and was entertained by Everett and Ida Watson, and that Everett shared office space with Joe Louis in Detroit in Paradise Valley Business District. Joe Louis' manager, John Roxborough, was also business associates with Everett Watson, and the three of them socialized much together. They also rode horses. Joe Louis had a farm in Michigan. John Roxborough, his manager, had a farm in Michigan. And we believe the original stables were on this side of what would have been the farm driveway, which is now the road into the preserve. Some of the other animals that we know the Watsons had here, in addition to horses, were turkeys, pigs, full-bred dogs. He had a kennel where he bred dogs. He had a pigeonniere, which is the French word for a pigeon house or a dovecote. And he had several connected farm buildings in a European style where different farm agricultural use buildings were connected all together, and they mimicked sort of this style of stone and brick to look European. And Ida later added a dairy cellar and did some work to the dairy barn that we're going to see next. Come along. We're now across the road from the house where the agricultural dependencies used to be but have been demolished. And this is just a vacant lot near Mud Lake and near Timms Lake. Everett was not born in Michigan. He was born in New Jersey in 1885. Eventually he moved to Chicago and then to Detroit. He was from humble roots, and he made his money himself through insurance agencies and actually through some illegal means of running a lottery system in the African American community of Paradise Valley. He used the money from the illegal lottery to not only build this estate and getaway, but also for philanthropic purposes in the African American community. He and John Roxborough were known for their philanthropy in Black Bottom neighborhood and Paradise Valley. They would donate money to the hungry to the poor, and made sure the holidays were special for everyone in their community. They also lent money for startup businesses in the African American community and tried to create equal opportunities for the community in terms of entertainment and business, and things like the Paradise Bowl, Paradise Theater were all part of Everett and John's plan to help African American society in Paradise Valley create their own society within a very racist society of Detroit at the time. So Everett was a prominent businessman in Detroit, and yet he purchased 422 acres out here in Jackson County, sort of in the middle of nowhere. And this was on what would have been the highway that connected to Detroit to Chicago before I-94 was constructed, which you could hear to my left. His retreat was also a working farm, in addition to being the place where Ida spent most of her time. And he did entertain lots of prominent African Americans here. We are now looking at the dairy cellar that Ida had constructed for the farm in 1945, according to documents that we found. This dairy cellar has a slate roof with varying colors from different states and a brick and stone construction with a heavy wooden door with strap hinges and board and batten siding above the door. Ida, at the same time, had the contractors dig a trench connecting the dairy cellar to the original 1910 dairy barn so that milk could be pumped underground to the dairy cellar for storage. This is vacant right now, but an apartment was put in here during the time period that the contractor who did the work on the house was living here. For several years, he lived in this little dairy cellar while he converted the barn to the new residence. This is the 1910 dairy barn with a gambrel roof. It has a truss system above on the second floor in the hay mow, which was an advancement over the post and beam system of early timber framing. This allowed a very large open space for more hay and straw storage. The first floor is where the dairy was located, and possibly horses in the front part with the cattle in the back, the milk cows. Hello again, we're inside the large dairy barn now that we think was built around 1910. This is the barn with the gambrel roof. The first floor was the milking parlor, and it still has the original stanchions where the cows would have been milked and fed, and the silos to my left, but the door is not working. We're going to go upstairs and talk about the truss system and where the hay was stored. We're now upstairs in the hayloft of the gambrel dairy barn, built around 1910. The roof structure is a early truss system with plank wood instead of timber framing. This allowed standardized lumber parts and nails instead of a craftsman, a timber framer that's highly trained, integrating each and every part of a post and beam structure using mortise and tenon. So this could go up faster and be much larger than previous barns, and that was because of technologies and innovations in how threshing occurred and how the harvest could happen after the invention of the hay track around 1880s. This barn does have a hay track, and so it was built to accommodate a hay track and the new modern farming methods at that time of harvesting and bringing the hay and straw into the barn instead of threshing in what was previously an English or a German 4-bay barn or raised basement barn or ground barn where there was a threshing floor. So this was very modern for its time in 1910 and showed the progression of agriculture in America. We're now inside the barn that I mentioned outside had been adaptively reused into a modern residence. This was the one that I said was a rabbit warren in this part and a machine shed or tool shed in the other part. And it is legend that Joe Louis did some training upstairs in this barn and also trained in the large dairy barn that we just left. We're not going to tour this whole facility because this was not where Everett and Ida lived. They did live up the hill in the mansion that is now gone. Ida's body was found up the hill in an unmarked grave a few years ago, and some people believe this place is still haunted by her ghost. The current owner is planning to research and try to prove who the architect of the farm was, of the farm buildings and the work that Everett and Ida Watson did while they lived here. We suspect it may have been Donald White, who was the first licensed African-American architect in Michigan. He was a graduate of the University of Michigan architecture program, which had a different name at that time. And he was part of the Tuskegee movement and he was an instructor and did some teaching at the Tuskegee Institute, where Booker T. Washington promoted African American society through training, technical training, which was in direct conflict with the Niagara movement of William Du Bois. Everett's life overlapped very much with the life of William Du Bois, although William Du Bois lived to be 95. So William was born before Everett and died after Everett, but Everett saw the same activities and struggles in his lifetime that Du Bois did. Everett lived through 2 world wars and the largest scandal in history of Detroit in terms of government. There was a very large trial that had thousands of witnesses and millions of words of testimony that involved Mayor Richard Redding and the police chief and commissioners and 88 police officers. 135 people were indicted, including Everett Watson and John Roxborough. Again, John Roxborough was the manager of Joe Louis. And this was all on conspiracy to obstruct justice. Everett and John Roxborough and many other prominent African Americans were running an illegal lottery system in Detroit in their neighborhood. They were not vicious gangsters with machine guns, the way you think of some of these other gangs like the Purple Gang and other notorious gangs. They kept the money within the community, and it kept circulating up to 7 times the same dollar or nickel, and would stay in the community. They very much promoted not to shop in a store or a business that wouldn't hire you. So if, for example, Hudson's wouldn't hire African Americans, they said you should shop in your own neighborhood of Paradise Valley, which was the business district of the Black Bottom community. And Black Bottom was named for its rich topsoil by the first settlers of the area, as an aside note. So Everett and John Roxborough were running illegally this gambling operation called the Numbers Racket. But the community loved them because they gave so much of their money back to the community. When the police discovered how much money was circulating in these neighborhoods, not just the African American neighborhood, but other neighborhoods of Detroit, they began to illegally graft money, sort of extort money from the most profitable policy houses. And this was the big scandal that took down Mayor Richard Redding and many others in the Detroit Police Department. Everett Watson and John Roxborough both tried to better life for African Americans in Detroit, which was very crowded in the 1930s and 40s due to the migration north for jobs in the auto industry. There was a massive housing shortage, especially for African Americans, and Everett tried to build housing developments to help aid this shortage of African American housing. He faced a lot of opposition by white neighborhoods when he tried to build housing developments that were encroaching outside of Black Bottom. He even faced arsonists who were paid by police officers to burn down the houses they had started building in a new housing development. Despite this, Everett was still very generous with his money and was very patriotic, donating money to causes that promoted America. He also sold war bonds and held war bond rallies at the club next door to his main business location. Everett was generous throughout his life with the money he made and should be remembered for all the wonderful ways he helped Paradise Valley and Black Bottom in Detroit. Not only did Everett face discrimination in Black Bottom and Paradise Valley by the white community, but during the trial, Everett remained cool even though he faced discrimination in the trial process itself. So many people were loyal to Everett because of his generosity that the police officer that eventually took him to the Jackson prison in Jackson County said it was the hardest day of his life. Many of the witnesses refused to testify against Everett because he had helped so many people in his community. When Everett and John Roxborough went to trial, they were tried with 63 other people at the same time in one lump trial. The prosecutor was O'Hara, and he used his authority to reject over 100 witnesses to get an all-white jury. Everett and John Roxborough both appealed to higher and higher courts until they got to the federal Supreme Court, which refused to hear their case. So they ended up serving 22 months for Everett and over 2 years for John Roxborough in the Jackson jail. When John Roxborough was released, Joe Louis was the one he was discharged to. Everett was discharged to his wife, Ida, and they remained at Cherokee Farms as their retreat, and Ida liked to stay here nearly full time. She passed in 1955. Everett continued his businesses in Detroit and coming to the farm until an uncertain date, but did pass in 1960. After that, Everett's estate fell into ruins. His children that he made sure went on to have great education. His daughters, one was a PhD and the other was very educated also. They did not return to the farm, and his son died young. So the house was sold to another family, the Moss family, and they found some of the possessions of Everett and Ida in the basement when they moved into the house, and a few items belonging to Joe Louis, or items of Joe Louis, including an 8mm film of Joe Louis practicing on the farm, training, but the film was lost to a fire or a flood while it was in the possession of the Moss family. They also found some of Joe Louis's signature drink called Punch, Joe Louis Punch. There was still some unopened cans in the basement of the mansion. But again, the mansion is gone, and the legacy of Cherokee Farms died with Everett in 1960. Thank you for taking the tour.